has no meaning, right? What the language is the speaking of the language. And so I hope that you'll, as you go through this course, view the sorts of applications we do as integral to learning the language of economics as speaking would be to learning the language of English or Spanish. And in some sense, the closest analog to falsifiability that there is in science, I think, is the fact that some things are easier to say in certain languages and harder to say in other languages. And I think you'll get a sense for what things are easy to say in economics and what things are hard to say in economics. And why and in what areas of life the things that are easy to say in economics are things that are powerful, meaningful things to express. And I think that that's sort of like what you saw in Friedman, right? So in what sense was Friedman science? It was science in the sense that he was using concepts that are not necessarily familiar to everyone, that are not necessarily the way that everyone would think of approaching things, to express ideas in a way that wouldn't have occurred to you or wouldn't have been so easy to do without having that language of economics to stand behind it. Now in reality, we know that there are languages, and then there are language families, and then there are dialects of languages, and so there's a whole hierarchy of theories and sub-theories and sub-sub-theories. And what each one of the lectures that we'll go through in this course will be teaching you a different dialect of economics, a different way that people in economics talk about what's going on in the social world. Okay. So, to start at the broadest level, I want to start with the piece by Gary Becker that I asked you to read. And Becker sort of articulates this vision of economics as a language, as a way of talking about things that can only be understood through seeing the applications, perhaps the most boldly and unapologetically, of anyone in the whole economics profession. One reason that I admire him so much. So his view of what economics is that it views individuals as having basically stable preferences that they maximize subject to constraints. And preferences tend to be preferences over pretty basic objects, fundamental things that people want, that you think any person would want, rather than being over things that different people might want and other people might not want. So preferences tend to be over things that can be derived from psychology, maybe from sociology and from biology, but aren't really the subject of economics. All constraints are interpreted as some form of price. And these prices are determined by the technology and information available to people, as well as in the social environment in which they find themselves, the market environment in which they find themselves. And this is where the laws of hard science enter in, because they tell us what are the technological possibilities. And finally, he argues that economists prefer to focus on the behavior of market aggregates, on the averages of people's behavior, rather than on the behavior of individual people. Now, that's a bit of controversy, because game theory tends to focus a lot more on the behavior of individual people or small groups of people. This course is going to be a course on price theory, so if we qualify this rather than saying economists, we say price theorists, you'll see most of what we're going to talk about are going to be about the average behavior of people in aggregates. And economists tend, whenever possible, to avoid talking about preference shifts. They tend to avoid, we will talk about uncertainty, and uncertainty will be important to the course, but whenever possible, we tend to try to avoid talking about uncertainty or about people being confused, because we're focused on this idea of people having purposeful action. Now, this is certainly not the only approach to take to think about social problems, and in many cases it may not be the best approach, but I hope that you'll find that, first of all, it's a useful way of disciplining your thinking. It's a powerful baseline for framing many social problems, and it provides a fruitful language for analyzing many questions including questions that might not immediately seem to be economic questions. So let me illustrate that by talking about some of the non-standard topics that Friedman, that Becker talks about. So, is Pablo Villar here? Pablo? What does Becker say about health? And what? You didn't. Okay. Does anyone else remember what Becker says about health and sort of how he wants to frame health in an economic way? Sorry, remind me of your name? Roman.
En la salud es un trade, entonces la gente, digamos, que pasa mucho tiempo haciendo ejercicio en vez de trabajar, pues tiene un trade frente a trabajar o hacer ejercicio. Entonces que al final de la vida pues todo termina siendo como suicidio, porque la gente pues maximiza y toma sus decisiones.
Exactamente.
Pero esos trades los llevan a suicidarse.
Trade-off es un otro ejemplo perfecto de la diferencia entre inglés y español. no hay palabra en español para trade-off. Yeah, exactly right. So Becker says that people choose how much to invest in health. That basically they always are committing suicide when they die in some sense. Because there always could have been something that they would have done that would have caused them to live a little bit longer. And so the distinction between suicide and natural death has to be, from an economist's perspective, placed on some different basis than simply that someone didn't do everything they could to preserve their life. Or, there has to be some notion of the motive or the situation or the trade-off that you're making that makes it a problematic suicide, rather than just the fact that you chose to die, because in some sense everyone chooses to die. And in fact, we should expect that people's wages, their education, how old they are, will all affect how much investment they make in their health, and therefore the chance of them dying. And so we're all making decisions that are affecting how much we're choosing to commit suicide versus stay alive at every time. How about on marriage? Anna is not here, right? No, I don't know this. Anyone else want to talk about Becker on marriage? So this is one of Becker's most famous papers. So he claims that people choose economically whether to get divorced or to marry. And they participate in a competitive market for that. Now, this has actually become a very common phrase. A lot of people talk nowadays in just common parlance about the market being good or the market being bad, and getting married and so forth. And there's even people outside of economics. This is one of many ideas that came from Becker that has now permeated society more broadly. Human capital is another one of those ideas. People talk all the time about human capital, but that didn't necessarily used to be the way people thought about the marriage market. But you can see very many traits that have to do with that. So you notice that in societies like in China, where there are many more men than women, men get stuck with, or tend to immigrate to look for more women, or get stuck with women who they're not so excited about, or and on the other hand, women have their pick of any man they want, right? So their price is much higher, and the men's price is much lower. And people tend to mate in ways that are economically rational. So people will tend to marry people who have similar education to them, because the education is complementary between the marriage pair, right? Because they want to be able to talk about the things that they understand, and so the person who's more educated is willing to pay more for a more educated spouse. But on the other hand, in terms of income, conditional on education, they tend to marry differently, because there's declining marginal utility of wealth, right? And so it's, if you're a wealthy man, conditional on your education, you'd be willing to accept a less wealthy woman if she's more beautiful, more educated, etc., right? And if, vice versa. And in fact, the reverse pattern as well. Wealthier women tend to marry less well-off men because there's substitutes. So we can understand many of the patterns of marriage in terms of, just pure transactional relationships. And he says even ideas, this is true. So my favorite example of this is the fact that I don't know if any of you are interested in specializing in the field of finance, but one thing that you'll find is that almost none of the papers in the field of finance have to do with welfare. They're almost all about predicting market prices. On the other hand, if you look at the field of industrial organization, almost all of the papers are about which antitrust policy would make things better or worse. Or even which particular actions are anti-competitive or pro-competitive. Now let me make another observation. There's almost no regulation of the financial sector in the United States, or at least there wasn't until recently. And there's almost no regulatory agency that bases its decisions on economic research. On the other hand, in antitrust, almost all the decisions that the agencies make are based on what the latest economics research says about whether this is a good merger to approve or whether this is a good policy or bad. And in fact, there's a huge industry of people doing consulting based on this economic research to try to persuade the agency to make one decision or not. So in one case, there's a huge amount of money based on the question, what would be welfare maximizing in terms of these antitrust policies? In the other area, there's a huge industry of hedge funds and investment banks that have a huge demand for predicting what asset prices will be. So should it be that surprising that we see production of one type of ideas in one place and another type of ideas in the other place? That's a traditional Beckerian type analysis of why we get certain fields looking certain ways, rather than just looking at the internal structure. Another approach would be to do history of economic thought, which is something I like as well. Just look at the internal structure of the field. What was this idea? Who built on that other idea? And try to explain things that way. But Becker would argue that at least as important of a factor is to look at who's paying the bills. Okay. And one thing I should say about that is that the tradition that Becker is part of, Becker is, I think, is a sort of right-wing Chicago guy, but that tradition really comes from Karl Marx originally, not from Adam Smith. Karl Marx said that we should try to reduce everything that we observe in the world, no matter what people say, no matter what the fancy stuff is in front of it, down to the fundamental economic motivations that are driving things. And Becker is, in some sense, the heir of that Marxist tradition. So, rationality is really the central foundation of economics. But we have to ask then, what does rationality mean in the end? So, Oscar Serrano? Is Oscar Serrano here? No. So, let me first ask, what is the most, one definition of rationality that I think you guys are probably used to, that's very common, that economists talk about most, is quote-unquote acting to achieve ends as well as possible. That is, we're not going to judge what people's goals are. We're just going to say that they should choose means that are as good as possible to achieve the goals that they have. Right? So, the key problem with this definition, which I'll try to persuade you of, is that, the question is what the word well means, right? So, is it possible to define what it means to choose means well to achieve the ends that you have without defining what one means by well and therefore imposing some set of normative criteria? So let me propose another definition of rationality, which is going to sound really silly and not at all like what you're used to hearing in the standard economics definition, which is that someone who acts in a manner that you can, if not sympathize with, at least respect at a certain level. That the person seems to have carefully reflected on the actions that they're taking, and that their goals and beliefs seem to be sort of worth listening to and possible of having sort of a conversation. The sort of person with whom it wouldn't be useless to try to talk. You don't need to agree with them, but it should also not seem like they're clearly confused or mistaken. And so what I want to try to persuade you of in the next 45 minutes, hopefully, is that the first definition of rationality is basically incoherent, despite the fact that it shows up in all your textbooks. And the second definition of rationality is the only one that you can really make any sense of. And the thing that's I want to note is that Becker's definition of rationality, if you read it, is much closer to the second definition. He doesn't do it, precisely that way. But he says, look, these states of preferences, these are common across people. Right? These are the common things that everyone wants. So that's imposing a lot on what people's preferences are allowed to be. I think that this second definition will also come closer to the notion of sort of a common language meaning of rationality. So, let me first talk briefly about, let me just interject one comment. So, somehow this didn't come up in the way that I structured these slides, but one natural comparison point for the notion of rationality is to evolution. So I think everyone would say evolutionary biology is a very scientific area. What is evolutionary biology in the end? It's an area that says things are very well adapted to their circumstances. Right? So it says organisms have roughly been chosen to be optimal given the settings in which they find themselves, right? Which is really exactly the same as the framework of economics, right? And all the types of problems that you can come up with in defining well-adapted in biology come up in economics as problems with defining what rationality means. And all the notion problems that come up in defining what rationality means are also problems that come up in biology. Basically, both of these fields are what I would call teleological. That is, they try to understand things as taking purposeful action towards some set of ends. And okay, so what does the notion of rationality serve for in economics? There are basically two purposes that rationality serves. So one is normative and asks, how should we as economists make choices and think and act? And this is useful because it helps us to resist sort of poor or confused reasoning and to argue with each other about what constitutes a good argument and what doesn't constitute a good argument. And that's very helpful in policy analysis. We use that as economists all the time to judge what would be the value of different social outcomes. Second is positive notions of rationality. And these have to do with how people actually do in practice act, rather than how we should aspire to act. And the fundamental postulate of economics, as I said, is that people act in a way that's close to what we think is normatively valuable. Most of the course, though not all of it, but most of it will try to interpret people's actions as intelligent, purposeful choices towards a reasonable set of goals. And it's a powerful approach, just as in evolution, where traits are interpreted as having adapted well to their environment. So, classical notions of rationality are based, as I mentioned earlier, on the consistency between the choices that people make and the ends that they're trying to achieve. So how do we tend to define this? This is the classic internal consistency notion of economic rationality. And again, Sergio, would you mind telling me, if we express things in terms of people's preferences, how do we define what it means to be rational?
For a person to be rational, we mean that the preferences are transitive and
yeah, it depends on whether you do it in terms of weak preference or strict preference. So, what does transitive mean?
That if you prefer A to B and you prefer B to C, you prefer A to C.
Exactly. And choose one of transitive, asymmetric or complete, to tell me what the other one is.
The relation is not asymmetric. You have that your A is preferred to B. It's not possible that B is preferred to A.
Exactly. So that's in terms of strict preference. So we write strict preferences as this little squiggly thing, and that means that you prefer some outcome X over some outcome Y. And asymmetry means that if X is preferred to Y, then Y is not preferred to X. Transitivity means, again, that if X is preferred to Y and Y is preferred to Z, then X is preferred to Z. So the basic idea is that if you reflect on the options available, you'll eventually come to some preference like this, because imagine that you preferred X to Y and Y to Z, but then you preferred Z to X. You'd say, okay, let me think about this. How could I possibly like Z more than X if I like X better than Y, but I also like Y better than Z, right? So it's just by internally thinking through, you should come to this sort of a problem. Okay. Another way that we can define preferences is in terms of the way, consistency is in terms not of the way that people have preferences over outcomes, but rather the way that they choose among different outcomes. So, Danielle, could you tell me what rationality means in terms of the choices that people make?
She must be consistent.
Well, so what does that mean a little bit more formally?
Well, next belongs to a group of choices, say X and Y.
Yeah.
We choose X over Y.
Yeah.
Then, if there is a third element,
Yeah.
X, Y is C, we must choose X over Y is C. It doesn't matter if C is known to the
Close, yeah. It's that. Did you say something about the relationship between Y being chosen over Z? See, that's the problem. So Z could come into the set, and you might choose Z over X and Y, so you don't need to choose X. But what is true is the weak law of revealed preference, which was, I think, what you were getting at, which is that imagine you have two things, X and Y, that are both parts of the sets A and B. And imagine that you choose X from A, right? So you chose X when Y was available. Then, if you choose Y from B, then you better also choose X from B. That is, if you choose something when the other alternative is available, then any time the alternative that you chose it over is available, you have to choose this one. So that's called the weak axiom of revealed preference. And these are basically two equivalent ways of expressing the same idea. Revealed preference is the theory that links these two things. And what it says is that you can always interpret choices as representing a preference, or you can choose preferences as representing choices that people make. If these notions of consistency hold on each one of them, and that these are equivalent to one another. Okay. So we say that x is preferred over y if any time that x is available, you do not choose y. So then you can show that the weak axiom of revealed preference implies transitivity. So how can we do that? So let's suppose that x is preferred to y and y is preferred to z. Then, what do we know? Well, if x is preferred to z, x being preferred to z, which is what we want to show. We want to show transitivity. We want to show that x being preferred to y and y being preferred to z implies that x is preferred to z, right? Well, that's the same as saying that z is not chosen from the set x, z, and z is not chosen from the set x, y, z, right? Because that comes from our definition here. Now, suppose that either of these two things is contradicted. Then, first, let's take this case. Imagine z was chosen from the set x, y, z. Well, that would contradict the fact that y is preferred to z, because y is available here and yet you're choosing z. On the other hand, suppose that that z was chosen from this set here, right? Then we know that by the weak axiom of revealed preference, z has to be chosen in any set where x is chosen. But we know that x has to be chosen in this set because we know y can't be chosen because x is preferred over y. So x has to be chosen here. So that would force z to be chosen, but that would contradict the fact that y is chosen. Right? So that shows the equivalence between, and you can go the other way pretty easily as well, that shows the equivalence between the weak axiom of revealed preference and transitivity. Okay, the final representation that economists typically use of these ideas is a utility function. And Pablo, here, what does it mean for a utility function to represent a preference?
It sets a number for depending on how much you like something. So you compare the utility of things depending on.
And how do you relate a preference to a utility function?
If the outcome of a utility function is higher than another thing, is that you prefer the first one.
Yeah, so exactly right. So we define it by saying that the utility of x is greater than the utility of y if and only if x is preferred over y. Now, for some purposes, this notion of utility is sufficient. But notice that this is only defined up to positive monotone transformation. As long as it's the case that anything that has greater utility than anything else, we can assign any numbers we want to the individual utility functions, and that makes it impossible for us to compare utilities across different people. So while for some purposes this is enough of a utility function, for other purposes it's not going to be enough. In particular, when we want to think about distribution of resources across people, and which is going to be important in almost every economic problem, this is going to be very important. So I also want to argue that this minimalist notion of rationality is very unsatisfying for many purposes. That is, that the utility function that just represents people's preferences and where we just view people's rationality as satisfying these basic results really is not only not very meaningful, but in some ways incoherent. Okay, so to do that, let me discuss a very classic example that economists and behavioral economists and psychologists typically give of irrationality. Okay. So let's consider first a setup where you choose between